Welcome. We're coming to you live from the wonderful campus, the beautiful campus of the University of St. Thomas here in the heart of Houston, your Catholic Urban University, for a dialogue series entitled, For Such a Time as This, Houston 2036. Of course, embedded in the name of our great city, Houston, is UST. So it's really UST 2036, for such a time as this. We'll be examining each week the current issues of our day through the very important lens frame of Catholic social teaching and social justice. We will dialogue with many thought leaders and guests throughout the coming weeks concerning the number one question yet to be answered, the great ethical, moral question: what is the fair and ethical treatment of all human beings? Think that for a moment. The number one aspirational goal and question: what is the fair and ethical treatment of all human beings? All human beings' lives matter. All human beings are equal. Let me ask you a question. What is your number one aspirational goal for Houston? Let's pick a point in time, 2036. Why 2036? 2036 is the 200th anniversary of the city of Houston. Our great city will celebrate its wonderful 200th anniversary. The great University of St. Thomas will be celebrating its 89th year anniversary on that journey and road to its 100th anniversary shortly coming. We want to work backwards along this timeline to 2036 so that we can begin to talk about the components necessary socially, economically, politically, and spiritually to live the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King of the beloved community. How do you make the dream? How do we make the dream of the beloved community a reality? And what are those realities in this post-George Floyd world that we're all living in? What should we be doing? How should we be acting and behaving? How should we be holding ourselves accountable to those benchmarks along this wonderful timeline for the next 16 years to 2036? So happy to have joining me to kick off this series for our first guest and the president of the University of St. Thomas, none other than our own Dr. Richard Ludwick. Welcome, Dr. Ludwick, for such a time as this. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Larry. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to be with you. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm looking forward to this one today, especially as we look at the important issues of our city, of our human family, and of how we can come together as a human creation of God.
Dr. Ludwick, you've been so good in our conversation dialogue that you just referenced. Every time we get together, they kind of take on their own wonderful life because your passion and commitments around these issues of understanding clearly in your tenure now as our wonderful leader and shepherd and president of the university, this question of understanding the role and place of an urban Catholic university whose whole mission is about social justice, how that plays into the life of this community going forward.
Well, that's a great question, and one that we have a 2,000-year tradition and heritage of guidance that gives us a strong foundation as we find that future and make it together. In fact, one of the things that drew me to the University of St. Thomas was that it is a Catholic institution in this urban environment that is Houston, Texas. And the fact that our community, Houston, is a place of great human richness by its diversity. That was for me just almost like I don't know that I could have described a more perfect union of what I thought was the place to come and to work, to commit my life to that in a way that I think all of us at the university do. And so our mission, as you say, is one that is a Christian mission. And that is that we believe that Jesus Christ came to this earth for all mankind, all those who had been born before and all those who would be born after him as well. So for us, carrying on that legacy and recognizing that each of us is born with an innate value that comes directly from God because we are created in his image, and how we embrace that community, how we share with one another the gifts that have been given to us. That's the real challenge for us, and finding the best ways to do that. And you know what? we're going to all make mistakes as we do that. But with our hearts in the right place and our heads and hands and feet moving in the right direction together, I know that we can do that. And Jesus said he came so that we might have life and have it abundantly. And I believe that when he said that, he meant all of us, and he meant all of us together. So that's when you distill down all the fancy rhetoric or fancy words that we have in the university's mission, in our own creeds and everything else, it comes down to the essential fact that when you look at God in the perspective of how we have it from our own faith tradition, as God is a community of three persons. And so when you look at his family, the image of God on earth, we see the family made up of all of us. And so we're all together, one body in Christ. That's what we believe. And whether you come from that tradition or not, it is something that drives us and makes, we hope, the society a better place, because that is the foundational perspective that we see for all people.
And how do we, with that wonderful context you just laid, how do we interpret, how do we reflect on a visual picture of someone being so non-godlike, so non-caring toward one's fellow human being? The episode that we saw played out with the police officer in Minnesota with his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that led to his death. Obviously, that thing, that entity under his knee, was not even deemed to be a human being, actually something even less than a human being, that one could do that with such cold callous and malice in the way it was done. That kind of tells us where we are as a society. And unfortunately, when it comes to certain things, that as you framed it so well, from a caring perspective of those who say we care and love, we have to figure out a way to counterbalance that, do we not?
We do. And, you know, we've all seen those horrific images. It is, I think, the human person at his worst when you see what happened to Mr. Floyd. So with us, we see that as sin, and sin has multiple layers, right? So you saw the one piece right there where obviously there was a sin committed by the forced death of Mr. Floyd. You also saw the individual sin of the person perpetrating that heinous act. You saw the greater communal sin of the human family having lost one of its members in an unjust way, in a vile and violent way. Then you see even at a more cosmic level with God himself, because as we move away from God, we move away from each other. And so for that kind of heinous act to be perpetrated on another, it demonstrates sort of the antithesis of the ideal as we all come together as a family in the image of God. And so for us, that we all should feel, I think, the pain and the suffering that comes from that, right? We have empathy and sympathy and hurt for Mr. Floyd, but all of us feel that we are damaged in that same, not the same way, obviously, physically, but in a spiritual way, we all have that same burden of a crime committed against our family.
And as bystanders, as caring people under the banner of faithful citizenship, as people who understand our role as a citizen, as a constituent, in a church term, as a congregant, Friday, Saturday, Sunday worship, church, prayer, temple, synagogue, and mosque, that's all the same in some ways. How do we begin to educate and understand that we have a duty, whether one calls it an ethical or moral duty? We have a duty, obligation, responsibility to the other, our neighbor. We love to talk about 2 of the 5 things of what it means to be a citizen, our individual rights and privileges. That's the great I and me discussion. What about the other 3, the duties, obligation, responsibility, which is the we and us conversation? We have struggled in this country, in this nation, to get to we and us. We're still not anywhere near we and us. maybe this episode of Mr. Floyd and all the outpouring around the country, around the world, about this issue of injustice, maybe it's time we can move that bar, that needle a little further down the road, just to be able to realize that what we've done from the 60s of teaching tolerance and having people just the bare minimum of dealing with another human being. I don't have to love you, like you, I don't have to work for you, I don't have to help you, I don't have to help you to achieve or succeed. I just have to tolerate you and move to acceptance of what it means to really accept the other person as a fully human being, that I want the best for him or her to help them not only grow and develop, but to flourish, whether it's getting a good education, whether it's getting a good job. That's where we have to move to in our society, or we're going to be Steve Kleinberg, our wonderful sociologist at Rice, tells us the thing about Houston. We're the most diverse, ethnically racial city in America, yada, yada, yada. We're also the most divided city, the most gated community, all those things. So where do you see this going? And more importantly, as you so well have articulated, the role that the university can play in this understanding of where we need to go along this line.
Well, for the University of St. Thomas, and you know that Thomas is St. Thomas Aquinas. So if for just a moment, I will borrow from him, and I will be ineloquent, but I will nonetheless borrow from him. When he talks about love, he describes it as willing the good of the other for the other. And so when you talk about moving from tolerance to inclusion or an embrace, I think that's part and parcel of what Thomas is saying there, that we move ourselves into what is good and good for the other, willing the good of the other for the good of the other, not for ourselves, not for somebody else, but for that particular person. And when we do that, we're truly acting in love. And so as we as a society, as we as a university, move more into our surrounding areas, engage with one another, we see each other no longer as someone to be tolerated, but we see the other as a part of ourselves, an opportunity to act in union with God for the betterment of that individual. And ultimately, that brings the betterment of society as a whole. You know, when you look at the great foundation of our religious tradition, and you look back when you snapshot, you just look back to the late 19th century, right? With a papal encyclical, that's a fancy word for the Pope wrote something down, right? And he talks about rerum novarum. That is a basis where you look at, so yes, individual rights, the I that you talk about, but then he goes on and talks about the worker, talks about the human family, talks about how justice must prevail in all of these relationships. And not just justice because it's the contract and you must do this, but it's because, reverting back to Aquinas, love is the centerpiece of how we are to engage with one another. So I know that's a really fundamental understanding, but you know, sometimes the most elegant solutions are the simplest. And so as we seek to move from tolerance to engagement to inclusion, it's really about love, seeing the other as the other and willing the good of that other for his or her good. And that's the foundational principle. And so when we as university engage the Houston community and beyond, we're looking to that. We recently have engaged with the Houston Food Bank because we want to tackle the real issue of food insecurity. And so that's now available on our campus, and we'll continue to do that. We began a veteran center on our campus that is aimed directly at taking care of those who have served us and the dependents of those who have served us as a community. That is willing the good of the other for the other. And just two examples. Yeah.
Quick question along that line. When you have moved the university to be involved more inclusive in the community as you've done, based on a great foundation that has been laid, you know, we are the university in a majority city. that is going to be predominantly children of color, students of color going forward. We've done a great job and continue to do a great job of recruiting, of developing those students, of reaching out and making sure they know that we are there, that we want them, that we are there to help them to do in an urban setting that's so important with persons of color, to give them unconditional love, to understand how we embrace that and do that. And I can speak to that because as a graduate of the University of St. Thomas, in full disclosure, on the campus from 68 to 72 during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, it always has done that. It always has given this unconditional love. So going forward, though, now, it is more needed in the urban setting than any other time to be a place, an anchor where people can come and join together post-COVID-19, perhaps even more than we can now,
right.
To be together, to understand the solidarity. I use that word intentionally, the solidarity of the human family, to talk about, as you just mentioned, our common humanity, the solidarity of our equality and equity, the solidarity of understanding how going forward in this city, as Kleinberg says, some things are not optional, about how we must work together and need each other. And I think what I hear you saying more and more, we know those foundational principles. We know those foundational things.
Mm-hmm.
We just got to figure out how to live them and how to live them out on a daily basis. And that's the challenge.
It is. That's always the problem or challenge, as you say, is getting the human person to act in accord with what he or she knows is right. And there are a lot of factors that get in the way of that, but good people can overcome those factors, we think, with the help of God. And as institution, we take on an ethos of the people who lead us, who are in concert with us with these organizations. So, for instance, one of the issues that we have in higher education is that there simply are not enough leaders and professors and others that come from the broader communities of color. And so one of the ways we're tackling that is with this great doctoral leadership program in our School of Education, where the vast majority of our students come from those underrepresented communities, so that we can credential and educate folks to serve all of higher education. Another example of that is the School of Education is in the top 20, the University of St. Thomas, in granting master's degrees to African Americans in the country. I mean, that's a little known fact. And we don't brag a lot about that stuff, but those are tangible examples of how we are taking affirmative steps. Is that enough? Clearly it's not. But when you look at our undergraduate population and you see 80-90% of it are students of color, this university is taking a leadership role in making sure we get into the communities, and the African American community in particular is one that we're very interested in increasing the numbers of success stories that we have and the numbers of students that we serve. So it is in that execution, if you will, in that getting in and doing, pardon the word, but doing the Lord's work to make sure that those high ideals are actually realized at the level of the human person to accelerate the inclusion and the success of the human family right here in Houston. That's what our goal is.
So in that frame of your goal and that you outlined so well, what's your biggest challenge going forward in achieving and accomplishing that goal?
I think the biggest challenge that all of us faces is how to talk with each other. I mean, you and I are having a great conversation, as we've had since we were introduced over 3 years ago.
Before you even got there, by the way.
Before I even got to Houston, that's correct. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge, that people need to be able to sit down, break bread, talk with one another, and move away from, if I can say, the political ideals. Right. And just see each other as people and as part of the family. Maybe it's the cousin you haven't met yet, that kind of a thing.
Right.
And that helps us understand one another and meet each other's needs. We're all given special gifts and talents. Our task is to bring those to full flourish and to share them freely with others. And you can't do that if you're not in community with others. And that's why I think that's the biggest challenge for us, is to be able to do that.
Well, I look forward to the day of being able to utilize the campus as we've done before. to bring such a great cross-section of Houstonians to the campus as we've done. And when I say great cross-section, in every sense of the word of diversity and every way you can think about it, because we were very good at bringing a great cross-section for a cornerstone, I think, of what you're talking about, developing of relationships of mutual trust and respect. We have to get people to know each other. We have to get people to understand each other's experiences. We have to have everybody understand our daily lived experiential realities may be different from the other, not better than, not more than, just less than. I mean, not better than, more than, or less than, just different. Just different. Right. And so that whole idea of we're all different in a diverse society like Houston, Texas, becomes so important, because I'm more convinced every day, when I mentioned earlier moving from that question of tolerance to acceptance, tolerance to inclusion, from diversity to pluralism. I want to get to that next level of pluralism. Because pluralism is a much deeper, richer thing in the way we deal with human beings. Diversity, we still count how many of this kind, how many of color, we got our boxes checked. In a world of pluralism, the human being counts just because they're a human being. No other labels necessary, no other titles necessary. And I think that also speaks about the wonderfulness of urban universities around this country and the world. The great urban universities, they understand that movement from acceptance, from tolerance to acceptance, from diversity to pluralism, because the next piece that you hear many times if you look through history, it's not enough to be this great metropolitan city, but all that definition entails. We got to move to be a cosmopolitan city, where the ideas and understandings and perspectives and viewpoints of everyone is welcome, in fact, sought out, that we want to hear from you. We want to know what you think and feel. We want to know how you may even act and respond around these issues, and how can we help you achieve those goals, and that everybody's needs and concerns are taken care of. That's where the social, economic, political piece comes in. But if you, as you've said so well, that social, economic, political piece has to be rooted, anchored, and contextually in the right spiritual reality of why we do it and why we're here. And if we get that part right, I'm convinced more and more as I go around this city, if we get that part right, we're halfway there.
I couldn't agree more. When you were talking about cosmopolitan, that reminded me of something, and that was the fact that so my heritage is Middle Eastern, right? So the great cities of Damascus and Beirut, where my families come from, and those were the crossroads of the world. And people that came there were seen for what their character was and what they did, more so than where they were from or necessarily what they looked like. And that's a tradition that branch of my family brings forward. And in some ways, Houston reminds me of that as a modern crossroads of the world, with everyone having come here, which gives us the opportunity to see each other for their character and for their abilities, rather than what they look like or what neighborhood they came from. So I think that tradition is a great one for this city to hold.
I think it is too. And I'm glad you put it in that perspective, because we have to understand this in the historical context in which it happens. The phrase, "I can't read," is really a phrase that is 400 years old. It goes back to slavery. It goes back to bringing a bunch of people to this country, making them less than human beings and property. That was really just property to be sold and bought. And when you do that, you now are inheriting the vestiges of slavery, catching up with us finally in this country, all these years later, from the laws of Jim Crow, from segregation, integration, to now resegregation again. The schools are all resegregated again, along more poverty and economic lines than race, but nonetheless, it ends up having the same effect. So this seed that was planted, this sin, this original sin of this country known as slavery, is now beginning to bear out in so many ways, until it's very clear that "I can't breed" has to become "we can't breed." That it's very clear it's not enough anymore just to be an anti-racist. To be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. And you have to do everything you can do as a caring person who calls themselves a caring person, a caring Christian, a caring Jew, a caring Muslim, I don't care. You got to stand up, speak up, show up, and follow up, and condemn what you see around us. When we're talking about the knee on the neck of the police officer in Minnesota, the other two officers standing there who did not say or do anything, the bystander is just as guilty as the person who had his hand on the knee. So the question becomes, how do we get people to engage? We need advocates, we need allies, we need people who are going to speak to the issues and be clear on their role that they have to play in this environment.
We do. I think all of us has to step forward, because we've seen too often throughout history, and especially in the last century, the 20th century, where good people did nothing while evil flourished. And that is a situation that we cannot tolerate in this country, and we can't really tolerate it across the globe. We have a responsibility to others, because we're called to care for one another in that way. And that's why the University of St. Thomas is going to be one of those actors in concert with other good people to make a difference in this city, to reach out and to love one another in a way that we think we're called to do.
And I not only know, feel, and believe deep in my heart that we can and will do it as the wonderful family of University of St. Thomas, but I think that shining star on the hill that we've been looking for and waiting for to help people understand this, of all faiths, of all denominations, can be done and led by the University of St. Thomas. I think it has to have a core. I think this is the core. I think it is the urban setting to do it correctly. And I look forward to working with you as we go forward on this. So before we run out of time, let me just ask you a more quick question to kind of put this in a great concept.
Good.
I referenced earlier this question of the key component, the moral question. What is the ethical moral treatment of all human beings, the fair ethical moral treatment? I would love to see the University of St. Thomas, through its various disciplines, ask that question and attack that question. What would that question look like if we played it out in education? If we played it out from a philosophical perspective, a theological perspective, if we played it out in the School of Business perspective, if we played it out, you see where I'm headed? What would that really look like in an interdisciplinary way, and particularly to each discipline, if we played that out to begin to see how that develops, so the frame in which we're looking for can be very clearly understood by others as we go forward?
Yes. So the context in which, in some ways, we have the framework that would allow us to do that already, and we've been tackling that from a different perspective. In our first year undergraduate programs, we have first year experience, and they have common reads. Last year, it was a read about immigrant children, and it allows for discussion in the framework, and then that happens. It is a common read that it happens throughout different classes. You have that as an opportunity for that discussion. The question that you posit, I think, is an outstanding one for us now, because with this institution being a Catholic institution, we have a rich tradition of already tackling those issues. I mentioned Rerum Novarum before. We have all of the documents from the Second Vatican Council, which deal with the people of God and the universal call to holiness. We think those are excellent foundations for dealing with just that. And then we take that context so it applies in the modern world in which we live, and answer those questions, or create more questions about how do we as an individual, how do we as a society cope and deal and overcome, so that we are anti-racist, as you suggest, but not only as you suggest, but as we are all called to be.
That's an excellent note for us to end on, because we're at that time and point. Dr. Lugo, I want to thank you very much for being our guest to kick off this wonderful series for such a time as this. We look forward to all of you joining us in the weeks to come. We're going to have a great guest schedule as we go forward. So let me end on this note. In the middle of this post-George Floyd reality, we're talking about systemic change. We're talking about changing systems. I think it's important that we touch on what a system is. A system is an organized body of people gathered around values, structures, and individuals. Values are defined, structures are put in place to implement systems, people are identified to maintain structures and institutions. Systemic change occurs when values, structures, and individuals are changed. And so the task of really systemic change that we're looking for, we want, have to realize that it involves all those elements. It is doable, but you have to take it as we do in steps. The short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals necessary to get to the point of having systemic change, system change, when it comes to racism, prejudice, discrimination, go down the list, institutional racism, all those things we talk about. It's going to take a little time, because when you're dealing with human beings, the individuals, when you're dealing with structures, and you're dealing with values, you're changing a culture. And to change a culture, I can change behaviors by holding people accountable to strict measures to get them to change behaviors. But to change a culture and to change a structure is a different thing. So we're going to be looking at how we do these things going forward with people who can help us, thought leaders, to frame this. It's all about the context that the text sits in the proper frame. So we want you to join us. We want you to be part of the dialogue. If you have ideas and guests for subject matters to be covered on upcoming segments of for such a time as this, please contact me. We'll make sure it happens. And so I'll just end for the first time on this note, in the immortal words of Dr. Benjamin B. Mays about reaching your stars and reaching your goals. But truly in the end, my brothers and sisters, truly in the end, for not failure, but low aim is sin. Let us in this post-George Floyd environment aim high, aim high, aim high. Until we see you next time, as always, peace, power, and love.